Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Christianity stands or falls on this one event. If Jesus never rose from the dead, you can forget the whole thing. If Jesus did rise, well, it changes everything. So here we are, 12 reasons to believe the resurrection.
Oh, wow. I'm so excited to get into 12 reasons why I should believe in Jesus and his resurrection. I've not been convinced yet of Jesus' resurrection, so I'm always open to new pieces of evidence, but my guess is that he's not going to provide anything that's new. My guess is that it's just going to be the same old bullshit we've always heard. So if y'all want to fuck around and find out what the 12 reasons are for us to believe in Jesus and his resurrection, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be analyzing a guy from the channel called Two Thieves, which I have to say is it's a pretty good channel name. It's about the two thieves that were, on the cross next to Jesus. And so, I don't know, it's a pretty good play on his religion. But in any case, he's got 12 reasons as to why we should believe in Jesus. But not just that he existed, but also in his resurrection and, I guess, his absolution of sins. Now, as you all know, I am a mythicist, so I don't think that Jesus actually existed in history. But for the purposes of this discussion, specifically Jesus, his resurrection, and what Jesus supposedly accomplished, I'm perfectly fine with starting from Jesus did exist, but did he resurrect? This shouldn't be taken as me somehow going back on my mythicism or anything like that. For the purposes of any discussion on the resurrection of Jesus, I don't think that the mythicism subject should really come up. So let's get into these 12 reasons as to why Jesus definitely resurrected.
Number 1, the professional execution. The resurrection is easily explained away if Jesus never really died. Like maybe he passed out, woke up in the tomb, called an Uber. But even the atheist scholar Gerd Ludemann says, historically it's indisputable that Jesus was dead. There are multiple historic accounts that confirm Jesus' crucifixion, both inside the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and outside the Bible. You can check out Josephus, Thales, Tacitus, Clement, Ignatius, and others. But nobody ever survived Roman crucifixion.
Okay, I want to stop it right here because I just need to point out that even if we suppose that Jesus really was crucified, let's just start from that point. It doesn't mean that Jesus resurrected. It has literally no connection to it other than the fact that Jesus has to be dead in order for him to resurrect. Just the simple fact that Jesus did die in the past does not mean that Jesus did resurrect. It is a non sequitur. It has no connection to it. But also, it's quite outrageous to say nobody ever survived Roman crucifixion. There have been some reports, like from Josephus, where people have been taken down off the cross and have survived crucifixion. So it's not exactly accurate to say nobody survived Roman crucifixion. But also, I like how in this section, he's like, just look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all say that Jesus was crucified. Well, yes, of course, Jesus was crucified in those because they were copying from earlier traditions and earlier sayings about Jesus. The first person to even suggest that Jesus was crucified was Paul. But I think that the arguments to suggest that Paul never really meant this crucifixion occurred on earth or even by the Romans are far stronger than reading into Paul that he was talking about those things. But I digress. I said before that I would accept that Jesus physically existed on earth, but that doesn't mean that he resurrected. And so even if Paul was talking about the Romans crucifying Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the worst pieces of evidence that you could use in order to substantiate that he was crucified. The correct reference to mention here is Paul. Paul mentions crucifixion. And even though I think you're wrong, you could definitely make the argument that Paul was talking about the Romans crucifying him. That is the appropriate reference to use here. not the Gospels, which do not represent history at all. He also brings up some early church fathers like Ignatius and Clement and others. All of those people are using the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So really, he's only used one reference here in order to substantiate that Jesus was crucified, and that's Mark. But even Mark isn't an independent source. Mark uses Paul and the other traditions that were surrounding Paul. So this is just shitty right from the get-go. Like, even from a Christian standpoint, this is just shitty evidence.
Before he died, Jesus was scourged to the point we're told his appearance was beyond human recognition. People died from this alone.
The only way that we know this is through the Gospels. The Gospels don't represent history, so I don't think that we can solidly say that Jesus was scourged. Can we make an inference that he probably was? Sure. I'm sure that there were crucifixion victims that were scourged beforehand. But the fact is that the current evidence that we have doesn't show that this happened to Jesus. It requires an inference from information that's not contained within our source documents. So I don't think that you can solidly say this.
He was then forced to carry his cross to a hill where he was crucified to death by professional government executioners who ensured he was dead by thrusting a spear through his side, likely piercing his lungs and heart.
All of that contained in the Gospels. Also, saying that the soldiers were professional executioners is a lot like saying that the trash guys are sanitation engineers. I feel like you're prettying up their actual jobs into something that sounds a lot more professional than it is.
If somehow he survived all this, he was then wrapped in linen, spiced, and buried in a guarded tomb for 3 days without air, water, or medical attention, all of which would have killed him. So point one, Jesus really died.
I don't think that you've actually proven that Jesus really died, but I've already said that I'm going to accept that Jesus lived and he died. So I'm fine accepting this first point, but at the same time, when you talk about the tomb being guarded and everything like that, that only occurs in one gospel. That's Matthew. The other gospels don't record any guards at the tomb or anything like that. So it just kind of seems like you're cherry picking information from the gospels, but you're primarily using the gospels in order to say all of this. So we really shouldn't take any of this as evidence that Jesus really was crucified. There are better reasons to say that he was crucified than what he has given here. All right, that's point one. What's point two?
Point two, the empty tomb. After 3 days, Jesus' tomb was empty. Today, nobody knows for sure where Jesus' tomb was because it was never enshrined. Nobody bought kitten cards, flowers, little windmills because he wasn't there. Even his opponents agreed the tomb was empty and guessed maybe the body was stolen, even though all of the valuables were left inside the tomb. And what's weirder still is they eventually found the body walking around eating dinner.
Our earliest reference to the idea that Jesus' tomb was found empty could possibly be in Paul, but that's reading a lot of information in it. Because Paul says that it was only according to the scriptures that he knew that Jesus was buried and then resurrected. He doesn't say anything about an empty tomb. So any talk about an empty tomb is coming from the Gospels. And so that's not going to work for us because the Gospels are not representative of history. Paul is a better representation of history than the Gospels are. And like I said, Paul only ever got his information from scriptures or from visions of Jesus. Really, what you have here is just visions and scriptures that are telling you that Jesus was resurrected, or that somehow inferring that the tomb was empty when Paul doesn't even tell us that there was a tomb to begin with. He just says that he was buried. That could have been in an unmarked grave. We don't know. All right, number three, what you got?
So that's point three, the fish dinner. The reports of Jesus' resurrection weren't metaphors like he rose in our hearts, nor were they spooky ghost stories like Jesus got buried in an ancient burial ground at full moon and came back as the walking dead. No, Jesus actually rose physically and fully from the dead. He visited friends, told them he wasn't a ghost, ate fish, and got doubters like Thomas to touch his scars.
See, the fact that you talk about touching his scars and then you touch your hand shows me that you don't really know anything about like the Roman version of crucifixion, because he wouldn't have had holes in his hands, dipshit. He would have had holes in his wrists. And the whole doubting Thomas thing only ever comes from the gospel, specifically the Gospel of John, which is second century gospel to begin with. And so he had all the other gospels in which to work from. But even then, Thomas was like fingering his little side hole and not exactly touching his hand wound, I guess. Or at least that's how he's generally depicted. I don't know. I guess he could have fingered his hole, all of his holes, however you want to take that. But it's also very important to understand that Paul, as well as the other Jewish Christians at the time, felt that the celestial realm was a physical place that you could go. That's why in the Old Testament they tried to build that Tower of Babel up to the celestial plane where God supposedly resides. So being that the celestial realm was a physical place, as well as like hell or Sheol or the Jewish version of Hades, that place was also a physical place that you could go to too, but nobody wanted to go there. Fuck that place. They all wanted to get to the celestial realm, which was just above the firmament. And so being that that's the case, of course, Paul would have thought that Jesus was a spiritual body that was still physical in some kind of way. So Jesus was resurrected, but it was this future resurrection body. The same body that Adam had and that our future resurrection bodies will be. And those would be bodies that are specifically made for the person and not the original bodies. Or at least that's what Paul says. All right, what's the next piece of evidence?
Number 4, the instant press. Jesus' resurrection wasn't some myth that developed slowly over hundreds of years. News spread immediately in the same towns and time as the events. If it blatantly wasn't true, this would never have spread. Instead, as more people actually saw Jesus, news spread like wildfire.
So this one's kind of curious because generally the time frame in which the Messiah of the Jews, like that myth or legend, developed, they generally want to put that as happening like right after Jesus died. The problem is that they have their time frames wrong, because the actual time frame for the development of the Messiah myth comes way before that point. The Messiah myth was actually developed in the Old Testament, and so it did have several hundreds, if not thousands of years in order for it to develop, and it culminated in the first century. They had this whole idea that the Messiah was to come and absolve them of their sins and save them and bring peace and all this other stuff. That's the thing that God in the Old Testament had always talked about doing. They expected it to come because of some prophecies in the Old Testament, which weren't exactly prophecies as originally meant by the author of it, but it was reinterpreted by later Jews to mean something else. And it eventually culminated in the first century with Jesus was supposed to come, or, well, actually specifically Jesus, because they actually named Jesus in the Old Testament. They give this Messiah a name, Jesus, but he actually has a lot of names. As if anybody's read Philo of Alexandria, you know that there's a lot of different names that Jesus goes by. The Logos, the Word, an Archangel, like that. There's a lot of different ideas about like Jesus' name, but you get my point. The myth about the Messiah had thousands of years to develop, so you're just completely wrong about this point.
It's point 5, the eyewitness crowds. It wasn't just one drunk guy at the pub who claimed he saw Jesus, or 2 friends sharing some grief-fueled hallucination. Literally hundreds saw Jesus after he died.
Oh, really? This is an interesting little tidbit. Can you name those people for me? I mean, we're talking hundreds of people now. We should have hundreds of names of people that wrote shit down or that shit was written about their experience. We should have hundreds of names that we can mention, right? But we don't. All we have are a few names of people that supposedly got visited by Jesus. That's all we got. We got Paul, we got Peter, and we might have 1 or 2 other apostles. That's it. That's all we got. Of course, Paul is the one that he's getting his hundreds of witnesses from. It's the 500 witnesses in the Pauline Creed. But the fact is that we cannot say who those 500 people were. So there's literally no way for us to know who exactly saw what and what they saw.
One report says 500 saw him together at the same time. In law courts, 1 eyewitness is helpful, 10 is compelling, but hundreds of first-hand eyewitness testimony puts things beyond reasonable doubt. Most of the history we treat as reliable is based on one or two sources. By contrast, we have an avalanche of data on the resurrection written down and then circulated at the time of the events.
We simply do not have much written about the resurrection at the time of the events. But actually, literally nothing at the time of the events happening. It only occurs much later, like 20 or so years, which is still good for historical information. Don't get me wrong. It's still good. But to say that it was written down at the time that it was happening is completely false. But also, all you have is a claim of hundreds of witnesses. I mean, if you were to get up into court and claim that hundreds of people saw this happen, and you didn't produce those witnesses, you didn't name those witnesses, you don't have any kind of written accounts by these witnesses, then you have nothing. All you have is a bullshit claim that hundreds of people saw something, and that's all you got. So no, you're really overplaying how much information was written down about the resurrection. He is counting like all of the different sources that come after Paul and far after all of these traditions had more than enough time to develop legendary aspects to them. So it really makes no sense to pile on all of this extra information when really you just have one source. You have Paul. Paul is literally our only source about Jesus that we have.
Number 6, the surprised faces. The accounts make clear that Jesus' followers hadn't planned this. They weren't prepared for this. When Jesus rose, Mary was at the tomb looking for dead Jesus. The disciples were off crying over dead Jesus, thinking they believed a lie. And they were just as used to death as you and me, probably more so culturally. They knew dead people didn't come back. They thought it was over.
Okay, this is all information contained within the Gospels. The Gospels are not history. So this point is pointless because you can't use the Gospels in order to prove anything about Jesus because we can't discern what in the Gospels are history and what's legend or what's myth or what was just made up by the author. And even then, you've only got one gospel that reports anything, and that gospel only has the women coming to the tomb, finding it empty, and then running the fucketh away. That's it. No post-resurrection appearances at all. Just an empty tomb. But even then, Mark's account is based on Paul's account and the other traditions surrounding Paul. So that's not even an independent source. You have to use independent sources for these things. If you're gonna say shit like, oh, they had surprised faces. None of them expected him to rise again. Why wouldn't they? Even in Mark, Jesus literally says that he is going to resurrect. He tells them that he's gonna do it. There's no reason for them to think that he's dead, or at least no reason to think that he's not going to resurrect. Of course, all of that is just an element of the story. That element being that the disciples, who are representative of the tribes of Israel, are dipshits. And they have always been dipshits. In the Old Testament, dipshits. And so that's representative of their dipshittery.
Number 7, the burning stakes. You know, as news spread around, Emperor Nero began executing Christians. Records describe grotesque torture, being torn apart by dogs, being burnt alive at stakes. All they had to do to avoid this fate was deny Jesus. But they didn't. They were fearless. Deny the resurrection or we'll set you on fire. Well, I saw what I saw, so light me up. They were praying in prison. They were singing whilst burning at the stake. Supposedly Peter asked to be crucified upside down. Whatever people saw, clearly it was worth giving their lives for. These are remarkably reliable witnesses who had nothing to gain but torture and death. Nobody got rich. They died for what they saw.
Okay, so this right here assumes that the original people that quote unquote witnessed the resurrection are the ones that are dying and being torn apart by dogs and burning on stakes and all this other stuff. That's not actually true. While he does mention Peter being crucified upside down, Peter was only ever, for as far as the evidence shows, an apostle, which means that he just got a revelation of Jesus. And that's it. He didn't actually see Jesus resurrect from the dead or experience any kind of like actual physical Jesus. He just got a vision of Jesus. So the people that were dying for the faith at that particular point were so far removed from the originators of the Christian cult that those people believed completely in the faith. And to say that they were persecuted because they wouldn't renounce the resurrection specifically is a bit misleading, because they were persecuted just for being part of a different group. That's it. Like, it's not about renouncing the faith or anything like that. Like, even if you look into Pliny, the thing that he was concerned with was the Christians still paying homage to the Roman gods. Like, that's what he was concerned about. And even then, there was no real reason to persecute the Christians. It kind of seems to me like you're twisting this a little bit. You're twisting the information to make it seem like the Christians were more persecuted than they actually were for, reasons that weren't the actual reasons. Also, the originators of the cult's Christianity were not the ones that were being persecuted in those fashions. I don't know what happened to the originators of it. Obviously, Paul was hunting a bunch of Christians before he turned into a Christian. But the fact is that the originators of the cult were not the ones being attacked by dogs.
8. The impossible converts. It wasn't just Jesus' religious friends who believed. The earliest Christians were a ragtag bunch of the most unlikely converts, including Roman centurions. One of the most unlikely of all was Paul of Tarsus. Paul was one of the premier enemies of Christianity, utterly devoted to stamping it out, kind of like a first century Richard Dawkins.
Well, technically, when he was Saul of Tarsus, not Paul of Tarsus. He became Paul once he had his vision of Jesus. So just a little minor correction there. And I did look up that the one centurion that was converted to Christianity did actually exist. But just because somebody's convinced of a position doesn't mean that that position is true. And if you look at the early church fathers, not even they historically verified anything that happened. So it's very unlikely that anybody did any historical verification when they would have been able to do historical verification. So the fact that somebody converted to Christianity literally means nothing other than they're gullible fucks.
But when he eventually met the risen Jesus himself, he gave up everything and became a lifelong missionary to Europe. That's kind of like Ricky Gervais and Stephen Fry starting a church plant. When Christianity's most ardent opponents convert, that's interesting. I mean, something happened to convince them.
Again, just because somebody's convinced of something doesn't mean that that something is true. This is a non sequitur. Both of those things are literally not connected whatsoever. People believe in false things all the time. Just look at flat earthers. They're still around.
Number 9, the honest details. The resurrection accounts are filled with honest details that, honestly, no one would make up. For example, the disciples who wrote some of the accounts come across really stupid. They were hiding, confused, doubting, disloyal. In one account, a disciple loses his linen cloth in a crowd and has to run home butt naked. That's embarrassing. I wouldn't make that up about myself.
Well, I don't know. I think that if you were trying to sound convincing about something concerning you running away naked, I think running away naked could definitely be something that you would make up. Like, let's just say that you were accused of threatening somebody with a gun. Well, it would be embarrassing to then say, oh, well, it wasn't a gun. I just had an erect dick and I was holding it while I was talking to you. That's an embarrassing thing. It would make sense to make up that embarrassing fact to cover up like threatening somebody with the gun, because that's an actual crime. So to say that, oh, I wouldn't make that up about myself, I think that there are definitely situations where you can make up you being a dipshit as the reason why something happened or something was written about you like that. But also, he's trying to use the criterion of embarrassment here, which is a common criteria that is used by apologists and some New Testament scholars. But the problem with the criterion of embarrassment is that you have to assume that the person who wrote this embarrassing fact about themselves had access to the knowledge that they were writing about. But as we know, definitely know, the Gospels were anonymous. So somebody writing something embarrassing about a person that lived prior to them and that was most likely dead, if even existed at all, is not really something that is interesting. That's totally plausible. So he's assuming that the people that wrote the Gospels were eyewitnesses and were writing about themselves running away butt naked, or other embarrassing facts like being dumb as fuck. Instead of accepting the fact that the disciples are representative of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the Gospels were wanting to represent them as bumblefucks, he goes the route of just saying, oh, they wouldn't have written this shit about themselves because it's embarrassing. It makes them look like dumbasses. Yeah, that's kind of the point.
Moreover, this was a patriarchal society. We know from ancient texts that women's testimonies weren't accepted in court, and yet it's women that are the first to discover the empty tomb. If they were making it all up, it wouldn't read like this. The only way these details would be there is if that's what actually happened.
You see, that's not true either. It's not that women's testimonies weren't accepted or trusted in court. It's just that it was unseemly for a woman to appear in court because they had this idea that court was kind of the man's space. And so to ask a woman to come into court to give a testimony was seen as like an affront to the woman. That's the context surrounding that. But also, the Gospels are not court documents. So that literally has no bearing on whether or not women would be trusted. You're also ignoring the fact that in the Gospels, the theme of the least shall be first is prevalent all throughout them. And so by ignoring this, you're totally stripping away the context in which the women were coming to the tomb. Because women going to the tomb to anoint the body, that was something that women would do at that time. That was not the job for men. Asking the men to go and anoint the body would be a lot like asking women to appear in court at that point. So no, the women at the empty tomb is not a convincing argument that the tomb was actually empty or that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead.
Number 10, the exact predictions. The Old Testament repeatedly points to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as God's plan of salvation for the world. Roughly 700 years before the cross, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. He was cut off from the land of the living, assigned a grave with the wicked. But after he's suffered, he'll see the light of life and be satisfied, for he bore the sin of many." Even Jesus himself on numerous occasions told people he would die and then rise exactly 3 days later. So this wasn't an accident.
Right, which kind of invalidates your point earlier about them being surprised by this. Of course, you could attribute this to them just being bumblefucks, because that's one of the themes in the Bible, but it really does invalidate your earlier assertion that they were all that surprised. Let's lay out the two propositions here. So basically, the two propositions are, A, Jesus was predicted, and this person, Jesus, fulfilled every single possible messianic prophecy that they could reinterpret from the Old Testament. He fulfilled every single one of them. Or these prophecies were written down, people reinterpreted these prophecies or reinterpreted these passages to be about the Messiah, and then they made shit up about the Messiah, regardless of whether or not he existed on earth. They made shit up to fit all these prophecies. And no one Jesus in the New Testament fits all 353 prophecies. Mark's gospel fulfills some prophecies. Matthew's gospel fills other sets of prophecies. Luke's and John's, they all fulfill different sets of prophecies, but taken all together, they fulfill all of the prophecies supposedly about the Messiah in the Old Testament. So there's they just made shit up about Jesus, or Jesus really fulfilled all of these things. Those are the two things here. And Christian apologists rather, tend to go with that Jesus actually fulfilled all these things, rather than the more plausible thing of people just made shit up. Obviously, I'm on the side of people just made shit up, including his existence altogether. But like I laid out prior to starting this video, I'm fine accepting that a real Jesus existed in history for the purposes of the discussion on the resurrection. But they still would have just made all this shit up in order for this Jesus to fulfill these prophecies.
11. The powerful God. You might have heard philosophers like David Hume say that miracles can't happen. No matter how much evidence you have for the resurrection, there's always more evidence from natural law saying people don't rise from the dead, so you're probably mistaken. And not only is that not how we assess probability and asking us to deny basic observation, but it presupposes that scientific law is the highest authority in the universe, which actually isn't true if there's a God who made these laws in the first place.
Okay, so first of all, your entire argument here hinges on this whole possible, therefore probable kind of fallacy that you're working with here. Just because it's possible that your God exists doesn't mean that he actually does exist. But your entire argument hinges on this idea that he does exist. So your God has to exist first in order for these things to make sense. Also, what he said about probability is not correct. How we assess how probable a conclusion is definitely relies on the prior probability for that particular situation. Like, for any supernatural thing that happened, any supernatural phenomenon, you have a monumental prior probability to overcome. It doesn't mean that it can't be overcome. You just need a lot of evidence to overcome it. So using the prior probability to correctly assess how likely some situation is to occur is exactly how we determine how probable something is.
If God exists, then it's perfectly reasonable to believe he's capable of breaking these laws.
If unicorns exist, it's perfectly reasonable to think they shit rainbows. Exact same kind of logic.
To enter his world and perform miracles, especially when that's what he repeatedly said he'd do, and then given all the evidence that he went and did it.
What evidence? There's no evidence that he went and did it. There's no evidence whatsoever that God has done anything in this reality. You're just ad hoc asserting that he's given evidence.
Number 12, the clear significance. Every religion and worldview out there tries to deal with the problem of suffering and death. Even humanists and atheists are trying to fix death today through technology because we all recognize it's our greatest problem. This is relevant for every human, including you.
I don't see what this has to do with anything. I mean, other than providing an explanation as to why these first century Jews made up this whole resurrecting Messiah thing in the first place in order to escape death, to provide hope for those that do suffer. So I don't understand what this has to do with anything other than it's an indication that this whole idea of an afterlife and idea of being absolved of sins and all this other stuff is just another survival technique of the human species.
I wonder if you've noticed how almost all our stories and films have a hero who goes to the point of death or actually dies only to come back and save the world.
Oh, yes. I mean, I have noticed that a good bit, especially in like ancient Greek texts, as well as other ancient texts too. They all have this whole idea of the hero dying and then resurrecting and absolving sins or saving people or something of that nature. It goes way far back, even before Christianity. It kind of seems to me like Jesus is just another product of that. So I don't know what your point is.
I won't give spoilers, but it's a lot. The idea seems ineradicably ingrained in our conscience. What if all that's telling us something?
You mean like people haven't come up with an original basic storyline in like 4,000 or 5,000 years? Yeah, people are not original.
What if the story's true that God sent Jesus to die and then rise again to defeat death and offer you and me a way through death?
I mean, that's incredibly cherry picking here. Why is Jesus the one exception to this rule? I mean, as you said, there are a multitude of different heroes in our past that have died, resurrected, and done everything that Jesus has done. But you seem to focus on this one particular Jewish fuck in the first century that supposedly died. And because the Old Testament says that his death will absolve sins, apparently that means that, he's absolved sins. This is the one exception to the fucking rule. Obviously.
I mean, if the resurrection's true and I'm trusting Jesus, then I don't need to fear death. It's a cat without claws, a scorpion without a sting. Death has been defeated. Jesus is king of the universe.
It seems like you're really, really into this whole Jesus is king thing. I'm really tired of that fucking phrase. But again, you're just cherry picking.
That means there's so much more to this life, and so much more than this life.
I mean, I find a lot of value in this life outside of God and Jesus. I don't understand what value all that adds to this life for you, though. Because it kind of seems like it devalues this life a little bit. Because if you have an afterlife that's so star-spangled fucking awesome after you die, It kind of seems like this life is just sort of really shitty, and you're just waiting on this afterlife where everything's perfect and you're absolved of your sins and everything like that. So, I mean, I don't understand, and I haven't understood this for a while. Why does Jesus add so much more to your life? Why does the idea of an afterlife make this life so much more meaningful? I have no clue.
Put simply, it changes everything.
I don't see how. To me, it doesn't seem to change anything other than devaluing what life we have now. It causes people not to live life to their fullest. Instead, they're focused on, well, what does God want? Fuck what God wants.
Sure, if the resurrection's false, well, the Bible itself says faith is futile. Christians should be pitied. But let me ask you, are you so sure there's nothing to this? Are you so confident Jesus is a myth and the resurrection's a lie? Because if I'm wrong about Jesus, then I wasted my life. But if you're wrong about Jesus, you wasted your eternity.
I like how he's ending it with a Pascal's wager. Like, are you so sure that you're wrong about this? Are you so sure that you're wrong about Islam? Or what about any of the other religions out there that have similar hellscapes to which you get banished if you don't believe in them correctly? Also, which version of Christianity do you believe in? Do you believe that you're saved by faith alone, or do you think that you need to do good works, or is there like some kind of combination between the two that you have to do in order to get into heaven? These are very important questions, because if you don't do the correct order of things, then you're still getting banished to a hellscape. So, I mean, I feel like saying, oh, are you so sure that this is all a myth and Jesus didn't resurrect? I don't see the need for questioning that. Like, it seems to me like your religion is just as plausible as the other religions out there. For me, that means that they're not plausible. The chances of your particular denomination of Christianity being correct is so minuscule that it would take a monumental amount of evidence to overcome the prior probability that you're wrong. Because there have been plenty of people that have been wrong about an afterlife and God and all this other stuff in the past. Pascal's wager shouldn't convince anybody. Pascal's wager is a horrible argument. It doesn't allow you to escape from this hellscape that supposedly we're going to get banished into, because you don't know which version of the Christian God is correct, let alone which version of any God is correct. But yes, I am very confident in me being unconvinced of the resurrection of Jesus, and telling an atheist or somebody that doesn't already believe in the resurrection of Jesus that, oh, are you so confident that you're going to risk your eternity, considering that I don't think the eternity you talk about exists? Yeah, I'm fine risking that. On the other hand, though, you did admit that you would be wasting your life if Jesus isn't real or didn't really resurrect. And that is something I'm not willing to risk. I'm not willing to risk the fulfillment of my life in order to bank on some supernatural asshole who, if you read the Bible, is nothing but a greedy, narcissistic, wife-beating dickhead in the sky, who is just as likely to pile drive you into hell as he is to welcome you through the door. Anyways, heathens, that's going to be it for the video today. I was not convinced by any of the arguments that he presented. It just seems like the same old shit repackaged in a different way. If you will, please let me know what you think about this video down below. Do you think it was convincing or no? Let me know. While you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.